Clint Hill's fingers close around the chrome handhold of the presidential limousine 1 second before history demands and John F. Kennedy lives. The third shot from the 6th floor of the Texas Schoolbook Depository strikes Hill's shoulder blade as he throws himself across the rear seat. The bullet's trajectory deflected just enough to tear through Kennedy's right shoulder rather than his skull. In Dealey Plaza, the screaming begins, but it is the scream of a wounded presidency, not a murdered one. What follows over the next 4 years will reshape American foreign policy in ways that no one watching the motorcade that November afternoon could possibly imagine. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. The man they rush into Parkland Memorial Hospital is grievously wounded but conscious. The bullet has shattered his scapula and collapsed his right lung. Doctors work for 6 hours to stabilize him. Outside, the world holds its breath. Inside, John Kennedy begins the longest convalescence of his presidency and the most consequential reassessment of his Vietnam policy. But the decisions he would make in that hospital bed, decisions kept secret from all but 3 people, would not become clear for months. For 3 months, America has a president who cannot walk across a room without assistance. Vice President Lyndon Johnson manages the daily machinery of government with characteristic energy, but the major decisions, the ones that will define the administration's second term, wait in a private suite at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. Kennedy's recovery is slow, complicated by the back injuries that have plagued him since the Pacific War. He reads voraciously. He summons only his most trusted advisors, his brother Robert, Kenneth O'Donnell, and Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield. The conversations in that hospital room are never recorded, but their substance becomes clear from what follows. Mansfield has warned Kennedy for years about Vietnam. "It could be a quicksand war," he wrote in a 1962 memo, "that would engulf our resources." Now, with time to think and no daily schedule demanding action, Kennedy listens. He reviews NSAM 263, the directive he signed just 6 weeks before Dallas authorizing the withdrawal of 1,000 military advisors by year's end. He asks his brother a question that Robert will later describe as the turning point. What exactly are we fighting for over there? The assassination of President Diem 3 weeks before Dallas has left South Vietnam without stable leadership. The generals who overthrew him are already quarreling, and Kennedy, lying in a hospital bed with a collapsed lung, begins to see a path that does not lead to 500,000 American troops in the Mekong Delta. Kennedy returns to full presidential duties in March 1964, a changed man, though only those closest to him recognize the depth of the change. General Maxwell Taylor and the Joint Chiefs present their familiar arguments for escalation. The communist insurgency is growing. The South Vietnamese military cannot hold without American combat troops. The dominoes of Southeast Asia will fall one by one if Washington does not act decisively. Kennedy listens with the patience of a man who has spent 3 months doing nothing but think. Then he asks a question that catches Taylor off guard. What does victory look like, and how many years does it take? The generals have no satisfying answer. They speak of metrics and body counts and strategic hamlets. Kennedy nods and requests another study, another assessment, another delay. He tells Taylor that he cannot authorize troop increases while the political situation in Saigon remains unstable. First, the South Vietnamese must demonstrate they have a government worth defending. The Pentagon grows restless. Cables between the Joint Chiefs describe a president who has lost his nerve. What they do not understand is that Kennedy has not lost his nerve. He has simply decided to stop letting the national security establishment make his decisions for him. Something changed in that hospital bed, something the generals cannot see. On August 2, 1964, North Vietnamese torpedo boats attack the USS Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin. 2 days later, radar operators on the Maddox and Turner Joy report a second attack in conditions of near-zero visibility. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara urges immediate retaliation. The Joint Chiefs see their opportunity. Members of Congress demand action. Kennedy authorizes airstrikes against North Vietnamese naval bases, but nothing more. When congressional leaders offer him the broad war powers that Johnson would later receive, Kennedy declines. Instead, he requests a narrowly worded resolution authorizing only the specific retaliatory strikes already completed. Senators Wayne Morse of Oregon and Ernest Gruening of Alaska vote against even this limited measure, arguing that any military action risks wider war. They are the only two dissenting votes, but their warnings echo Kennedy's private fears. In our timeline, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution gave Lyndon Johnson essentially unlimited authority to wage war in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration. Kennedy's narrower resolution provides no such blank check. The difference seems minor in August. By the following year, it will prove decisive. Barry Goldwater smells blood. The Arizona senator accepts the Republican nomination in July 1964 with a speech that directly attacks Kennedy's Vietnam policy. Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. Goldwater thunders, and everyone understands what he means. Kennedy is too weak to defeat the communists, too hesitant to use American power, too sophisticated to understand that the world respects only strength. The campaign that follows is brutal. Goldwater's supporters paint Kennedy as a failed Cold Warrior who allowed Cuba to host Soviet missiles and now permits communist expansion across Southeast Asia. Kennedy wins re-election, but his margin of victory disappoints his supporters. The 1960 election was decided by barely 100,000 votes. The 1964 election, which should have been a landslide after the economy's strong performance, produces a victory of only 4 million. Kennedy reads the returns as a warning. The American public will tolerate restraint in Vietnam, but they will not tolerate defeat. He must find a middle path, or his party will pay the price in 1968. In early 1965, Kennedy makes a decision that his own cabinet opposes. He caps the American military presence in Vietnam at 20,000 advisors, rejecting Pentagon requests to double that number. Publicly, he frames the decision as confidence in South Vietnamese capabilities. Privately, he tells McNamara something that leaves the Secretary of Defense shaken. "I am not going to send American boys to die for a government that cannot hold its own country." Simultaneously, Kennedy authorizes secret diplomatic contacts with Hanoi through French intermediaries. France withdrew from Vietnam after the catastrophic defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The French understand something Washington refuses to accept, that this war cannot be won by foreigners, no matter how many troops they send. The negotiations proceed slowly, hampered by mutual distrust and Kennedy's need to maintain hawkish rhetoric for domestic consumption. But they proceed. By late 1965, the military situation in South Vietnam has deteriorated significantly. The Viet Cong control much of the countryside. The government in Saigon has changed hands twice more. American advisors report that their South Vietnamese counterparts lack the will to fight aggressively. Robert McNamara, who once championed military intervention, sits across from Kennedy in the Oval Office and speaks words that will never appear in any official record. "Mr. President, I no longer believe this war can be won without a full American commitment, and I no longer believe a full commitment would be worth the cost." It is the moment Kennedy has been waiting for. His Secretary of Defense has finally reached the conclusion that Kennedy himself reached in a hospital bed 2 years earlier. Now the question becomes how to withdraw without appearing to surrender, how to save American credibility while accepting that the dominoes may fall regardless of what Washington does. Kennedy begins laying the groundwork. In speeches, he emphasizes South Vietnamese responsibility. In private meetings, he tells congressional leaders that America's commitment must have limits. On March 15, 1966, President Kennedy addresses the nation from the Oval Office. He announces a gradual reduction of American military advisors in Vietnam, tied to benchmarks of South Vietnamese performance. The speech is carefully crafted to avoid any suggestion of surrender. Kennedy speaks of honoring commitments, while recognizing that no nation can defend another nation that will not defend itself. He frames the withdrawal not as defeat, but as transition, a recognition that this conflict must ultimately be decided by Vietnamese, not Americans. The reaction is divided. Hawks in both parties accuse him of abandoning an ally. Doves argue he should move faster. In Saigon, the South Vietnamese government issues a carefully worded statement expressing confidence in its own military capabilities. In Hanoi, the North Vietnamese leadership debates whether Kennedy's announcement represents opportunity or trap. History will judge the decision differently than Kennedy's contemporaries do. In our timeline, Lyndon Johnson sent 500,000 American troops to Vietnam. More than 58,000 of them died. The war lasted another decade and ended in the same result that Kennedy's critics predicted: communist victory. Whether Kennedy's earlier withdrawal would have changed that outcome, whether it would have saved 50,000 American lives or merely accelerated South Vietnam's fall, cannot be known. What can be known is that a single second in Dallas, one heartbeat of time during which a Secret Service agent's reflexes proved just slightly faster than history demanded, created a path that the real John F. Kennedy never had the chance to walk. The bullets we dodge shape us as profoundly as the ones that find their mark.